I want you to picture the coldest morning you've ever experienced.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, really put yourself there. It is December 1860, and we are in northwest Texas,
Right.
right up against the Pease River. It's pre-dawn. You know that bruised purple color the sky gets just before the sun comes up?
Oh, absolutely. The dead of winter.
Exactly. And the temperature has dropped so low overnight that the grass along the riverbank, it isn't just frosted, it's completely stiff.
It snaps if you step on it.
It snaps, it's that cold. And moving through this frozen terrain, you have a column of men.
And we're talking about Texas Rangers here.
We are. Led by a young captain named Lawrence Sullivan Ross.
Right. History knows him as Sol Ross.
Sol Ross, yeah. But what really stands out about this column immediately is the silence.
Which is weird, right? Because a column of horses on frozen ground usually sounds like a drum line.
It's deafening normally. You'd hear those iron shoes clattering a mile away.
So how are they quiet?
Ross actually ordered his men to wrap their horses' hooves in cloth.
Wow.
Yeah, they used like gunny sacks, old blankets, whatever they could find. They needed to muffle the impact completely.
If they're tracking someone.
They've been tracking a target for 3 days, and their scout had finally spotted these thin lines of lodge poles against the winter sky the previous afternoon.
So they know exactly where they're going. I mean, this is a surgical strike.
It is a surgical strike. Ross orders his men to just hold their position behind a ridge until the very first crack of dawn.
And that's a tactical decision, isn't it? Not just a dramatic one.
Definitely tactical. He wants the light behind them when they attack,
So the rising sun is right in the eyes of the camp.
blinding anyone who tries to run. It creates the silhouette effect.
That is chillingly calculated.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's talk about who is actually sleeping in that valley.
Right. It's a Comanche camp. It's sitting in this shallow depression near a bend in the river, mostly to block the wind.
How big of a camp?
Maybe 15 lodges, so about 60 people total. But here is the crucial detail the scout reported, and it's the detail that really changes the entire moral complexion of what happens next.
Okay.
The camp is quiet.
Meaning the warriors aren't there.
Correct. Most of the fighting-age men were away on a hunting expedition. They were following a buffalo herd that had been spotted out to the west.
Oh, I see.
So what remained in that camp was the logistical core of the band. You have women, children, and just a handful of elderly men who were, frankly, too old to ride.
The people who actually keep the community going.
Exactly. This is the community that processed the hides, dried the meat, and really kept the culture alive.
So purely from a military standpoint, this camp is completely vulnerable.
It's the softest possible target.
And that's why Ross chose that specific morning to attack.
That is exactly why. At first light, the order is given. The Rangers just come over the ridge at a full gallop,
Are they shooting right away?
firing as they ride. The very first shots are ripping through these buffalo hide lodges before anyone inside is even fully awake.
I can't even imagine the chaos of that. Waking up to the sound of hooves and gunfire, and then the sun is blinding you on top of it.
It was absolute pandemonium. You
Yeah.
really have to understand the fog of war here.
Sure.
Our source material describes some horrific things.
Like what?
Well, a woman emerges from a teepee carrying a bundle, which is likely a baby, and she is knocked sideways by a rifle ball before she takes 3 steps.
God.
Children are scattering into the tall grass like quail. Horses are screaming. And the Rangers, they are riding through the camp in a line, just shooting at movement,
Just shooting at anything that moves.
at shapes.
Yeah.
Honestly, in that dawn light, with smoke drifting from burning lodges and dust kicking up, the distinction between a warrior and a woman.
Or a fighter and a child.
Right. That distinction just dissolved in the first 30 seconds. It wasn't reestablished for 20 minutes.
And in the middle of this absolute nightmare, there's a specific moment that shifts the entire narrative, isn't there?
Yes, there is. In the chaos, a woman breaks from the far edge of the camp.
Okay.
She's running north through the tall brown grass along the river. She's clutching an infant to her chest, and she's running with that desperate, uneven stride of someone who knows speed is the only thing keeping her child alive.
And a ranger spots her.
He does. And being on horseback, I mean, he closes the distance in seconds. He draws alongside her. He has his pistol raised.
Does she keep running?
She stops. She knows she can't outrun a horse. She turns to face him. And then she does something that makes this ranger pull back on his reins so hard his horse nearly sits down.
What does she do?
She holds the child up toward him, almost like an offering or a shield. and she screams a single word.
In Comanche.
No, in English.
In English. Wait, she's in a Comanche camp, dressed as a Comanche.
And she screams, American? American.
That is wild.
She screams it again, and her skin is totally weather-beaten, right? Sun damage from years on the open plains. She's covered in soot. But when the ranger looks closely at her face,
What does he see?
he sees her eyes. They're blue.
Oh, wow. This is Cynthia Ann Parker.
It is the ghost to the frontier.
Wow.
She had been taken from her family settlement of Fort Parker 24 years prior. She was just 9 years old when she was taken.
So she grew up completely Comanche.
Fully integrated into the tribe. But in that moment of absolute terror, facing death, that one word from her childhood American was literally the only weapon she had left.
That is such a heavy way to start this deep dive.
It really is.
Because usually for you listening, when we hear about Cynthia Ann Parker, at least in pop culture or older textbooks, it's framed as this great rescue story.
Right, the lost girl is finally found, the classic searcher's narrative.
Exactly. But today, we were doing something different with our sources. We aren't just telling a story about a rescue.
No, we're not.
We are using this moment on the Pease River as a gateway into a much darker, systematically suppressed history.
Because the source material we're looking at today suggests that what happened at that camp, the specific targeting of women and children, that wasn't an accident.
It wasn't collateral damage.
Right. It was a documented strategy of annihilation. And the central thesis of our deep dive today is that these atrocities were not lost to time.
They were preserved.
They were preserved in archives in the Ranger's own reports. But they were deliberately excluded from the history books.
Why?
To protect the mythology of the Texas Rangers.
Okay, so let's unpack this machine. We need to talk about the Texas Rangers themselves.
Yeah, let's start there.
Because in pop culture, they are the guys in the white hats, baseball teams, museums, TV shows. They are presented as the ultimate heroes of civilization.
The ultimate frontier myth. Men of iron will, protecting the innocent. And look, we should be clear, that image isn't entirely false. They were effective, and they were incredibly brave.
You'd have to be.
You don't ride into Comanche area unless you have nerves of steel.
Okay.
But we need to clarify their actual role. They were not a police force.
And they weren't the regular military either, right?
Yeah, correct. They were a paramilitary organization. Their mandate shifted depending on who was governor at the time, but it basically centered on the removal of indigenous people from territory that Texas wanted.
And here's the thing that really surprised me in the sources. Originally, they weren't even good at it.
Not at all. Early Rangers were just farmers, militiamen.
They were reactive.
Exactly. They would wait for a raid to happen and then try to chase the raiders. And against the Comanche, they were completely hopeless.
We need to talk about the Comanche as an adversary, because they weren't just a tribe in the way we often think of small, localized bands.
No, they were the dominant empire of the southern plains. They were called the Lords of the Plains for a very good reason.
Let's stick on that word for a second. Empire. We don't usually use that word for Native American groups in North America.
But it absolutely fits. They controlled a massive territory called Comancheria. They had a distinct border. They had vast trade networks. And they had a military advantage that was almost insurmountable.
Explain that dominance to us. What were the early Rangers actually up against when they rode out?
Horsemanship that bordered on the impossible.
How so?
Well, a Comanche warrior learned to ride before he could even walk. In battle, a warrior could hang off the side of a horse using just a heel hooked over the animal's spine.
Just a heel.
Just a heel. And they would fire arrows from under the horse's neck while at a full gallop.
So they're using the horse as a living shield while moving at, what, 30 miles an hour?
Exactly. They presented almost no target to shoot at. And then there's the rate of fire. This is just a basic physics problem for the Rangers.
Right, because in the 1830s, a Ranger is carrying a single-shot muzzle-loading rifle.
Walk us through the mechanics of that, actually. I think we forget how slow those guns were.
Yeah, okay, so you fire your one shot, boom. Now you have to stop your horse completely. You have to take powder, pour it down the barrel.
Right.
You have to patch the lead ball. You have to ram it down the barrel with a rod.
It takes forever.
And then you have to put a percussion cap on the nipple. If you are very, very good under pressure, that takes 45 seconds.
And in those 45 seconds,
a Comanche warrior can loose 20 arrows.
20.
Yeah. So if you miss your one shot, you are dead 20 times over before you can reload.
It's not a fair fight. It's a slaughter.
So the early Rangers are basically just targets out there.
They were losing badly. But the turning point comes in the 1840s. with a man named Captain John Coffee Hayes.
Jackie.
Jack Hayes. He realized that to fight the Comanche, the Rangers had to become them.
Meaning what? They had to learn to ride like them.
That was part of it, but mostly it was the logistics. The U.S. Army and the early militias, they fought like Napoleon.
With supply wagons and tents.
Right. They marched 15 miles a day, set up camp, drank coffee.
Yeah.
Hayes looked at that and said, "We will never, ever catch them doing this."
So he stripped them down.
Completely. No wagons. You carry what you need on your horse. You sleep in the saddle or just on the ground. You eat dried meat. You move 80 miles a day.
He turned them into light cavalry.
Exactly. He made them mobile. But mobility wasn't enough. They still had to solve that firepower equation we talked about.
And this is where technology changes history.
A crate arrives from the Northeast, from a struggling inventor named Samuel Colt,
The Colt Pattison revolver.
the great equalizer. It looked a bit fragile, honestly. It had this weird folding trigger. But it held 5 shots.
And crucially, you could fire it while riding.
You didn't have to stop to reload.
So suddenly, the ranger isn't fumbling with powder while arrows are flying past his head.
Right. There's a famous engagement, the Battle of Walker Creek in 1844.
What happened there?
15 Rangers, armed with these new revolvers, took on about 70 Comanche warriors. Now, usually, the Comanche would draw out the rifle fire, wait for the Rangers to start reloading, and then charge in for the kill.
But this time, the reload never came.
The Rangers just kept shooting. One of the surviving warriors actually later said it was like they had a shot for every finger on their hand.
It completely broke the algorithm of the fight.
It did. But here is the key insight for this deep dive, and this is something that gets overlooked a lot in the hero myth.
What's that?
This technology didn't just help them win battles. It shifted the Rangers from a defensive militia into an offensive strike force.
Because they finally had the firepower to go on the attack.
Once they had the Colt, they stopped defending settlements and started actively hunting camps.
And that shift from defending homes to hunting camps leads us directly into the darker side of this history. We need to talk about the cycle of violence.
Absolutely.
Because the Rangers didn't just wake up one day and decide to be brutal. There was a context of very real fear involved here.
We cannot gloss over the reality of Comanche raids on the settlements. They were terrifying.
He attacked at dawn, right?
Usually at dawn and often during the full moon, what the settlers called the Comanche moon.
It was bright enough to ride by.
Yes. And they killed fighting-age men, they killed the elderly, and they kidnapped women and children.
The fear among Texas settlers was genuine, deep, and generational.
And that fear provides the permission structure for what comes next. It's very hard to advocate for restraint when your population is terrified.
It radicalizes people. It justifies any escalation. And the flashpoint for that escalation, the moment where diplomacy essentially dies and the word extermination begins, is the Council House fight.
March 19th, 1840.
Set the scene for us. This is in San Antonio, right?
It is. It's supposed to be a peace negotiation. The Texans demand the return of all white captives held by the Comanche.
And the Comanche agree to meet.
Yes, the chiefs arrive. 65 of them, actually, including women and children who came along. They're expecting a standard parley.
But they don't bring all the captives.
They bring only one captive, a 16-year-old girl named Matilda Lockhart.
And the description of Matilda Lockhart in the archives, it's gruesome.
It is difficult to hear, but for you listening, it's really necessary to understand the Texan reaction.
Yeah.
She had been with the Comanche for 2 years. Her nose had been burned off entirely.
Just leaving exposed bone.
Yes. Her body was covered in sores and burns. She had been tortured systematically.
My God. So she walks into this meeting.
She walks in as the living embodiment of every single settler's worst nightmare.
And the Texans just snap.
When the Texans saw her, the negotiation was effectively over. They were horrified and they were furious. They demanded the other captives immediately.
But the Comanche chiefs didn't have them.
They explained truthfully that they didn't have them.
Because the bands were decentralized, right? Chief A didn't control the captives held by Chief B.
Exactly. It was a fundamental cultural misunderstanding. The Texans thought the Comanche were a nation-state like France or Britain.
Like, you are the leaders, give us the prisoners.
Right. But the chiefs couldn't give what they didn't have. The Texans viewed this as bad faith. They thought the Comanche were holding out for individual ransoms.
So what did the Texans do?
They locked the doors of the council house, and they attempted to take the chiefs hostage.
And that went about as well as you'd expect a knife fight in a locked room to go.
It turned into an absolute slaughter. 35 Comanche were killed, And that included women and children who were waiting outside in the courtyard.
And the Comanche response to that?
Retaliation was swift and apocalyptic. The Great Raid of 1840, where they burned towns all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico.
But for the Texans, this event was the end of trying to talk.
This is where the policy shifts entirely.
This is where the language changes.
Yes. Governor Maribel Lamar completely rejected Sam Houston's previous peace policy. And the new directive, which you can find right there in the archives, used a very specific, very heavy word.
Exterminate.
Exterminate.
That is, I mean, that's not a military term. That's something else. That implies removing a pest, not defeating an enemy army.
It's a statement of total war. And that brings us to the strategy of annihilation. The Rangers stopped just fighting warriors on the plains. They began targeting the foundation of the Comanche people.
What does that mean, practically speaking? How do you target a foundation?
You have to look at how Comanche society was structured. The warriors fought. That was their role.
Right.
But the women processed the food. They built the lodges. They raised the next generation.
They were the infrastructure.
Exactly. If you kill a warrior, the tribe loses a fighter. But if you destroy the women's ability to work, or capture the women themselves, the tribe loses the capacity to exist.
So attacking a camp was actually more effective than winning a battle.
Cold logic, but yes. Especially in winter. You have to understand the biology of survival on the plains.
It's a calorie deficit game.
Exactly. If you destroy a camp in December, burn the lodges, burn the food, the bullet doesn't even need to kill you.
Exposure will do it.
Exposure and starvation.
So the anatomy of these ranger raids was pretty consistent then.
Very consistent. They would wait for the warriors to leave on a hunt, attack at dawn, and target number one was always the horses.
Why the horses? I mean, apart from transport.
The horse was the economy. It was their wealth, their status, and their mobility. If the Rangers killed or scattered the herd, the Comanche were stranded.
Because a Comanche on foot in the middle of the plains is effectively helpless.
Yes. And target number two, the resources.
Burn the lodges.
The reports are chilling to read. They counted the lodges, destroyed like scorecards. 10 lodges here, 20 there.
Then the food stores.
Destroyed. The pemmican, the dried meat that was supposed to last that band until spring, all burned.
And what about the people inside the camp?
Indiscriminate violence. The official sources, the ones that made it into public record, they talk about the fog of war and the dawn light.
Rangers just shooting at shapes.
Right. But then you look at the ranger letters, the private correspondence.
What do they say?
They admit to killing women and children. And the tone of these letters, it isn't remorseful. It's like accounting.
Just doing the paperwork.
Yes, we cleared the area. We dispersed the enemy.
It's the banality of it that gets me.
It is the bureaucratization of atrocity. And for the survivors of these raids, the nightmare was really just beginning, which leads us to the experience of captivity.
We really need to talk about the legal status of these captives, because usually in war, there are rules. If you capture civilians, there are protocols.
Not here. This is a crucial distinction. The Republic of Texas, and later the United States, did not recognize the Comanche as a sovereign nation.
So they weren't prisoners of war.
No. They were legally considered contraband. Seized property.
So they had no legal rights whatsoever, no treaties governing their treatment.
None. They were in a complete legal black hole. And the physical reality of their captivity reflected that. On the journey back to the settlements, the Rangers rode their horses.
And the captured women?
The captured women walked.
They walked.
For how long?
Days, weeks, hundreds of miles across the plains.
And if they couldn't keep up?
The archival reports use a euphemism. They say stragglers were encouraged.
Encouraged?
Which meant beaten or dragged by ropes behind the horses.
Oh my God.
They were often bound with rawhide, and rawhide tightens as it dries out in the sun, cutting into the skin.
But the physical pain wasn't even the worst part, according to the sources.
No. The oral histories from the Comanche tell us that the deepest trauma, by far, was the separation of the children. This part is just heartbreaking. How did that happen? Was it just chaos on the trail?
No, it was often highly systematic. The children were cataloged separately from the adults.
And then what?
Some were given to white settlers along the route to be used as servants or adoptees. Some were sent ahead to orphanages in the east.
And some.
Some simply disappeared from the records entirely.
For a Comanche mother.
Who viewed her children as the absolute center of her spiritual and physical existence. This was worse than death.
It seems like a deliberate strategy to break them psychologically.
In many cases, it was exactly that. And when they finally arrived in the Texas settlements, Things didn't get better.
Because they were put on display.
These women were paraded through the towns. And you have to remember the context we talked about earlier. The settlers were deeply traumatized by previous Comanche raids.
Right, they had lost family members themselves.
So when they saw these captive native women, they didn't see human beings in pain. They saw the enemy.
So there was mob violence.
There was spitting, striking, verbal abuse. These captive women became surrogates for the warriors the settlers couldn't catch on the plains.
The rage of the frontier was just taken out on the most vulnerable people in the equation.
Exactly.
Ugh.
Which brings us back to the woman we started with, Cynthia Ann Parker. Because her personal story really encapsulates this whole tragedy.
It does. Let's go back to her. So she is taken back to her uncle, Isaac Parker.
Yes. And Texas celebrates this as a glorious rescue. The newspapers run massive headlines. It's a huge victory.
But for Cynthia Ann,
For Cynthia Ann, it was a second capture.
she didn't speak English anymore, right?
She had forgotten it almost completely. She was 33 years old. She had been Comanche since she was 9.
In her mind, she wasn't Cynthia Ann.
In her mind, she was Nadua. That was her Comanche name. She had a husband, Peta Nocona. She had 2 sons, Quanah and Pecos.
And suddenly she is locked in a house in East Texas.
Locked in.
Yeah.
Effectively a prisoner.
She couldn't leave.
She was constantly watched to prevent her from escaping. She actually tried to run away multiple times to go back to her family.
The Texas legislature even got involved, didn't they?
They voted her a pension and a league of land. They basically treated her like a state mascot.
But she didn't want any of that.
She didn't understand the concept of owning a plot of land, and she certainly didn't want it. She just wanted to go home to the plains.
And she had her daughter with her in captivity. Prairie Flower.
Top Santa. Prairie Flower. She was the only link Cynthia Ann had left to her real life.
But tragedy struck there, too.
Yes. Prairie Flower caught influenza and died at age 4.
And that just broke her.
It completely destroyed her. After her daughter died, Cynthia Ann began to decline rapidly.
She stopped eating, didn't she?
She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. She essentially willed herself to die. She passed away in 1870.
The analysis of her life here is just stark. She was destroyed by both worlds.
Captured at 9 by the Comanche, captured at 33 by the Rangers. She never truly belonged to herself.
It's devastating, and honestly, it foreshadows the fate of the entire Comanche Nation.
It does.
Because the war does end, eventually.
It ends in 1874 and 1875, the Red River War.
This was an Army-led campaign, right? Not the Rangers.
Yes, Army-led. But they used the exact Ranger tactics we've been discussing, attacking the logistics.
Attacking the foundation.
Right. And the decisive moment was at Palo Duro Canyon.
I've heard about this. This is the story about the horses.
Yes. Colonel Mackenzie captured the main Comanche herd, over 1,000 horses.
And he didn't keep them.
He ordered them shot.
1,000 horses.
The soldiers lined up and fired into the herd for hours, the noise of the gunshots echoing in the canyon walls. Soldiers actually wrote about it in their diaries later as something that deeply haunted them.
But the tactic worked.
It worked perfectly. Without horses, the Comanche ceased to be Comanche. They couldn't hunt the buffalo. They couldn't fight.
They were stranded.
They had to literally walk to Fort Sill and surrender.
And once they are on the reservation, the war continues, but in a very different way.
It shifts from a physical war to a war on their culture.
How so?
Well, we talked about the economic power of women earlier, right?
Processing the hides, building the lodges.
On the reservation, that power was destroyed instantly. There were no buffalo left to process. There were no lodges to build because the government gave them canvas tents.
So their knowledge became obsolete.
Overnight, women went from being the primary economic drivers of their society to being dependents.
And the government used rations to control them.
Hunger became a formal policy weapon. The beef rations were strictly tied to compliance.
So if you stepped out of line...
If you danced the old dances or held the old ceremonies, the beef shipment might magically not arrive that week.
And then the boarding schools.
This is the final phase of the strategy. Under the philosophy of Captain Richard Henry Pratt,
Who famously said...
kill the Indian, save the man.
Right.
Children were taken from their parents by force or by coercion.
Meaning the threat of starvation.
Exactly. If you didn't give up your child to the school, your family didn't eat.
And at these schools, it was total erasure.
Total. The first thing they did was cut their hair.
Which is a huge deal, culturally.
In Comanche culture, you only cut your hair when you are mourning the dead.
Oh, I see.
So by cutting these children's hair, they were essentially putting them into a state of permanent mourning.
And they changed their names.
From Comanche names to things like Mary or Ruth. And speaking their native language was strictly forbidden and punished physically.
And the conditions at these schools, the mortality rates were horrific.
Tuberculosis, influenza outbreaks. There are over 180 graves at the Carlisle School alone.
Kids who just never came home.
And those who did return. They often couldn't even speak to their mothers anymore because they had lost the language.
The generational bond was completely severed.
Yes.
This leads us to the final and perhaps the most important question of this whole deep dive.
Question of memory.
Yeah. Why don't we know this? Or I should say, why didn't we know this for so long? I certainly didn't learn about Lamar's exterminate order in my history classes.
This brings us to what historians call the wicked historian thesis.
Okay, unpack that for us.
It's important to understand that these documents, the ones we're citing today, they were never actually lost.
They didn't just dig them up in a cave somewhere.
No. They're sitting in the Texas State Archives.
Mm-hmm.
They're in university collections, the Federal Archives.
Yeah, I've been there the whole time.
The exterminate orders, the letters describing the killing of women, the reports on starvation tactics, all of it has been publicly available for over a century.
So it's not that history forgot, it's that history chose to ignore it.
Exactly. It was a conscious, active choice by those writing the curriculum.
To construct a specific narrative.
Textbooks, museums.
Mm-hmm.
They focused entirely on the bravery, the territory gained, the quote-unquote taming of the West.
They edited out the complications.
Because they had to maintain the hero myth.
Right, because if you admit that the state's strategy involved systematically targeting non-combatants and children,
you undermine the entire moral foundation of the state's origin story. You turn the heroes into something much more complex and, frankly, much darker.
But there's a postscript to all of this in our sources. A bridge between that historical silence and the truth.
Quanah Parker.
Cynthia Ann's son.
Yes. The little boy who ran into the grass at Pease River while his mother was taken.
What happened to him?
He survived. And he grew up to become the last great chief of the Comanche.
Wow.
He fought the Rangers and the Army for years. But eventually, he realized the war was lost, and he adapted.
He became a politician, right?
A major politician,
Huh.
a wealthy rancher. He even went hunting with Teddy Roosevelt.
But despite all that assimilation, he never forgot his mother.
Never. He spent years petitioning the government, searching records, trying to find where Texas had buried her.
Did he eventually find her?
He did. In 1910, he successfully had her remains moved from Texas to Oklahoma. He personally reinterred her.
That is incredible.
And when Quanah died a year later, he was buried right next to her.
It was a reunion that Texas history had tried to prevent forever.
But Quanah made it happen in the end.
So as we wrap up, what does this all mean for you listening today?
Well, first, we have to acknowledge that the Comanche Nation survives.
Right. They are still here.
Over 17,000 members, headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma. And they are actively running language revitalization efforts right now to undo the damage of those boarding schools.
But the legacy of silence, that's what we really need to reflect on.
Definitely. Censorship isn't always about burning books in the town square. Sometimes it's just quietly leaving things out of the curriculum.
It's the silence that does the heavy lifting.
Precisely. The documents are still waiting in the archives for a history that is brave enough to include them.
That is a lot to process, but it's a very necessary correction to the story we all thought we knew.
It asks a really provocative question, I think.
What's that?
If a society builds its entire identity on a specific story, what happens when it finally admits that the story was incomplete?
That's a huge question.
Does the heroism survive the whole truth?
That is definitely something for everyone listening to mull over on their own. Thank you for guiding us through this material today.
It was an important journey to take.
And to you, our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.